Good evening. If we're ready to start, please. Make sure everybody has their cell phones turned off. And welcome to our latest event at the Issam Institute. This is a talk that Professor Joe Khalil will give us. He's a visiting assistant professor at Northwestern University in Qatar, and his specialty is media, digital media, new media, and particularly he's interested in how young people in the region have been using new media. His latest book that just came out, co-authored with Marwan Kraidy, is Arab Television Industries, and he did his research for his PhD dissertation on youth-generated media in Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, which examines the alternative media cases in both countries. He's been at Qatar for the last year at Northwestern teaching, and he's contributed also some of his work to the report that IFI and UNICEF Regional Office have been working on for the last 2 years about youth in the Arab world, which is going to be published as a 3-part series starting in late March. You'll hear about it soon with a very extensive examination of all dimensions of young people's lives, to which several AUB professors have contributed and around 50 scholars around the region. So it comes at a timely moment with all of the events going on around the Middle East, and Joe's work has contributed to this as well on the media side. So we're very happy to have him talking about the making and unmaking of uprisings, reflections on youth-generated media. Thank you, Joe, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rami, for this warm introduction. I also want to thank the Issam Institute for their interest in research on and about youth. This is something very rare in the region. And before this starts to sound more like an Oscar speech, I also want to thank Munira for insisting on making this happen. I have to tell you, we've been trying to make this work as far as schedule, and scheduling it on and off for the past, I don't know, like 4 or 5 months. When I decided to leave Chicago and relocate with Northwestern to Qatar to be closer to the field of study that I'm doing, which is Arab youth and media, I had no idea that youth making media will be chasing me dar dar, zinga zinga, as Gaddafi is saying. These are exciting times to be in the region. I'm sure all of us are trying to find ways to make sense of what's going on and what are the implications in the long run. Well, instead of detailing specific case studies that I'm working on for the forthcoming book, what I decided to do is sort of share with you a series of reflections on what I call youth-generated media, the types of media made famous in connection with the protests in Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere in the Arab world. As a quick sort of introduction to what I mean by youth-generated media, these include, but are not restricted to, your posts on Facebook, your tweets, the blogs, but also graffitis, videos, songs, and other forms of communication developed and circulated by young people with or without the assistance of adults. Now, a few premises before I start. The series of youth uprisings that are actually taking place are far from over. So anything that we'll be doing, I'm doing, is just preliminary at this stage. It's not definitive by any way, and any lessons that we're learning will take years before we actually get to understand what's going on. Young people are involved in making media for a number of reasons. All you need to do is just walk around campus and see the kind of graffitis that are written on the walls. The reasons include political, social, cultural, religious, and other reasons. Another premise, for a starter, youth-oriented media, the kind of media that Rotana, MTV are involved in sort of supplying for young people in the region, which include young people on screen. introducing stuff and working as role models. That type of media are structurally different from youth-generated media, my topic of the day. So what are youth-generated media? Since 2006, I've been working on this, and this is sort of my working definition for it. Youth-generated media are historical processes. It's not young people involved in making media is not the result of technology. They've been doing media way before that, and the kind of media that young people have been involved in doing involves this idea of reappropriation and redefinition. Taking specific images, taking specific music, what we refer to, for those of you who are musicians, sampling, reworking already present material, and repurposing this to their own ends. These ends being self-expressive artifacts that are developed, circulated, and consumed by young people. And I stress on the idea of it being developed, circulated, and consumed, the three act. And this concept of youth-generated media is composed of those three words. Youth. And one has to acknowledge that there are limitations to the demographic age brackets. According to the World Bank, it could be 12 to 26. In the US, it would probably stop being at 18. In the Arab world, we've seen them at the age of 50, still calling themselves young. In Lebanon, with plastic surgery. Go figure. So the idea of being young, or the definition of youth, is very elastic in that sense. Generated, and this is something that I'll be talking about later on, the idea of creating, distributing, and consuming media. And media itself, the definition of media, it extends beyond the mass communication model, beyond the idea of radio, television, the press, and now the internet. It goes way beyond that. It includes performative acts, for instance. I talked about graffiti and other forms of communication that young people are involved in as a mean of self-expression. So why do we need to pay attention to youth-generated media? Well, part of it is the idea that some would be the idea that, well, I guess for me, the only reason why I think we need to be paying attention to youth-generated media is the idea that we can learn so much about young people's cultural politics. And it's very interesting that if you've been watching television, and I'm sure you were, the coverage of the uprisings, one of the most telling moment was the idea that all the message that young people were trying to convey was distilled into, a couple of words: down with the regime. As if all what young people were saying and all what their demands were, just that. And I think, having been working on this for quite some time, studying what young people are producing in terms of media tells us much more than this. It tells us their cultural politics, what ideas they're trying to promote, how placating opponents, articulating identities, acting in and reacting to everyday life. And it's very important, this idea of cultural politics, because on many levels, there are so many contradicting images that result out of the combination of mainstream and youth-generated media. What we see reported about young people in the Arab world and what young people themselves are trying to convey. And these, this is just a couple of the themes that I found out in my research. They are at once nonviolent and rational, yet easily mobilized around hot buttons related to politics and religion. Those of us who remember the Danish cartoon saga that went on for a while. Yes, I'm calling it a saga because we were following it as someone was researching this. I was following it day in and day out, and it seemed never ending because it was this hot button that was actually triggered by this. Young people are educated and eager to demonstrate their competence in developing secure and prosperous societies, yet often unemployed with very limited future prospects. This is one of the messages that young people in every single square are trying to tell us, yet we rarely see that. Young people are absent from the political process and often missing socioeconomic opportunities, yet are expected to bear arms and sustain regimes. Those are the conscripts in every single army that we have in the Arab world. Young Arabs, like most youth, do not form a homogeneous mass, but rather tend to regroup as cohorts within and across national borders, religious affiliations, economic conditions, and other variants. If you monitor some of the collaborations that were taking place during these uprisings between bloggers across not just the Arab world, but Arabs in the diaspora, and in my own work on the 2006 war. Some of the media that was being produced by young people during that period was also multi-territorial and deterritorial at the same time. As communication production tools become more accessible, 20 years ago, if you wanted to shoot a video, you needed to have a very bulky camera that cost about $10,000. Now you could do this with much less than that on a smaller level. So as communication production tools become more accessible, both in terms of cost, but also in terms of weight, in terms of accessibility, and so on, price, young people are developing their own identities as individuals through media. Just to give you an idea of, is there a chance we can dim the light a bit? Just to give you an idea of what I mean by youth-generated media, this is a sample from what young people were involved in doing in Lebanon and Saudi Arabia. Actually, we should be doing the opposite.
الاستمرار كيف يكون؟ بحيث انه كيف انه يكون في اتجاه يعني ما يكون سلبي علينا ولا بنفس الوقت ايجابي على الاخرين. فالمؤلف اعطاني انا كمدون اعطاني اكثر من دافع اني استمر.
ودلوقتي تكررت يا ريتا انا شو رسالة ترى اكيد جايين هنا عشان نعرف شوف كيف اليوم طول عمرك ترتب فانا بدور عشان ترتبهم بس انت ايه يلا رتبهم
Okay, so what makes youth-generated media? What are, in my opinion, 5 characteristics that we need to pay attention to if we are to examine what young people are doing and infer ideas about
politics. The first one is the idea that they demonstrate culturally negotiated creativity. And unlike professional media, where creativity is motivated by either fame or fortune, you do a job for a pay or in order to get your name in the paper. Young media makers engage in re-examining the world. They don't care about that. And in the process, develop creative images, sounds, words, and tunes. It's a different form of creativity that is culturally negotiated, in which it's very much contextualized in their own environment, rather than trying to cater for their own selfish images or selfish egos in that sense. It's more implicated in their societies. The second one, the idea of developing and circulating hybrid artifacts. Youth-generated media materializes itself in specific artifacts. And these types of artifacts are shared among each other, the idea of circulation, which happens within a particular group or with the world. And this is something that we've seen within the uprisings. It reflects a specific type of energy that is high level, but yet at the same time it's short-lived. If you examine some of the bloggers, the consistency with which they blog and the number of posts that they do tends to vary a lot, depending on and to what extent they are implicated in a specific issue. And the last one is the idea that these types of artifacts usually end up triggering sequences of events. And these events are usually multi-territorial. They happen in various countries, but they also happen out there in space. They are deterritorial, which are not limited to media artifacts and often escape states' territorial control. And we've seen that also with the kind of messages that young people were putting out during the uprisings. These artifacts are usually elements in a chain of events or actions that combine media to other examples of cultural politics in action. And this is where, in many cases, the idea that you develop an artifact that is either becomes part of a movement or it triggers an actual movement. I'll give an example of one that triggers, that sort of becomes part of a movement, but ends up triggering one. You've seen in the videos the I Love Beirut campaign. Anybody heard of that? Yeah? Well, it started off between two groups, one group in Lebanon and one group based in New York. Actually one person based in Lebanon and a couple in New York City. The folks that started it in New York City ended up sending the PDF file to the guy in Lebanon, who at the same time distributed it to other folks and asked them to go out, print it out and stick it on monuments in their own neighborhoods, take pictures of that sticker on the monument, and then send out these pictures back to him, who in turn distributed it to others. Now, that's what I mean by this idea of a sequence. So it's not just one aspect, one artifact, but a chain of activities that are associated most of the times with one particular artifact. Now, I started off by talking about, and this is something that I hold dearly, having worked for over 13 years in mainstream media, and then decided to focus more on alternative media. The idea that the relationship between youth-generated media and mainstream media, and hence the title, the idea of the making. By developing culturally creative hybrid artifacts that reflect forms of energy and trigger sequences, the four characteristics, youth-generated media have pushed boundaries of permissible discourse. The kind of messages that young people are involved in making are much more than what is permissible on mainstream media. They dispel certain normative conceptions about youth. Some of these normative conceptions about youth that they are careless, irresponsible, not implicated in terms of politics in their own environment, and they managed to prove that somehow wrong. And they offered young people an alternative to the social, cultural, and political vacuum in Arab public life. And that is something that for those of us who monitor mainstream media feel strongly that it's lacking. The presence of young people as role models within mainstream media. And you're talking to someone who was involved in developing several shows with young people, and we can take that up during Q&A. But I can tell you, it's a different role model. It's a different game in the process. When it comes to uprising, the relationship also changes. In many times, what young people try to do with their artifact is use mainstream media as a platform to disseminate that message to a wider audience. Now, in the process, they lose control of that actual image. Here's now I'm called now I'm going to be called a traitor. From the mainstream media's playbook. Here's some of the things that I watched. Okay, a news presenter asking a demonstrator, "Why can't you appoint a spokesperson? We don't want to be chasing you around." And this is live on air. Another asking a media proclaimed youth leader, and again, a media proclaimed youth leader. They never proclaim themselves as being youth leaders. Okay, media cast them because they want to have a hero. They want to have a poster child for an uprising. Would you consider running for office? And a third reporter advising young protesters, and again, the ideas of the normative images that we have about young people, that they are not in control of their own image, that we need to constantly advise them because they are adults in the making. A third reporter advising young protesters, you need to organize, perhaps develop into a political party, an image that they can actually, a frame that they can actually relate to and focus on. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of time before the Q&A to talk about 3 challenges ahead for youth-generated media, especially in our relation as this is an academic community, so in our relation as academics, but also in our relation as mainstream media, how we can sort of relate to them, and the kind of challenges that are imposed on them moving ahead. What we need to do is sort of avoid the temptation of merely celebrating alternative visions. The fact that young people are involved in making their own media, that doesn't mean that all young people are involved in making their own media. And what we need to do is sort of pay closer attention to how Arab regimes resist threats, encroach on spaces, and muffle voices. And I don't mean the literal space, even though the literal space, as we've seen in Bahrain, is also a place is also being sort of invaded in that sense, but also the kind of a virtual space where young people's ability to think outside the box. Muffling voices, the idea that you can actually, and this is still happening, by rounding up bloggers and putting them in jail, that you can ensure that these voices are going to be muffled. Well, that's not going to be the case. But at the same time, the temptation of us celebrating these as being what all young people are involved in is something risky. Is something that we need to be cautious of. Rethinking about the direct and indirect links between Arab regimes, private investors, and the establishment of youth-oriented media platforms. What I'm referring to as the political economy of Arab media. And the case in point here is precisely what happened in Egypt. A little bit of history. During the late 90s, when actually by 2001, private television stations were allowed to be broadcasting on satellite in Egypt, and this was all orchestrated by Safwat Sharif, the guy who ruled Egyptian media for a number of years. But the way it was orchestrated is by licensing specific businessmen who are friendly to the regime, and in the hope that at some point down the road they're going to be called upon to actually support the regime. Now, the hour of need was knocking a month ago, and this is why I'm saying we need to be rethinking about these links, because what actually happened, these television stations got split between their mode of operation, wanting to remain relevant to their audiences, wanting to remain relevant to their business interests, having a sort of a popular appeal, but at the same time paying up to the regime. And we can talk more in details about what happened, but the idea of rethinking how mainstream media itself is structured in the Arab world, and what governs the decisions that are being made in terms of supporting a particular uprising or muffling it, is also worth rethinking. Young people's uncontrolled dissent and increased public visibility equals to a perception of power by and that's why political elites, columnists, sociologists, police, and commercial interests cast their own definitions and interpretations of what they're seeing in terms of uprising. And this is why we've seen them sort of define what is politically pragmatic in the so-called Cedar Revolution, or the Independence 05. What fit acceptable news frames during Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution. What is morally putative in the case of Bahrain's demonstrations. And what is commercially viable in the case of an all Egypt, all the time coverage that was actually taking place. So these multiple interests are triggered and are motivated to react simply because, or primarily because this uncontrolled dissent that young people are displaying through their images, through the kind of artifacts that they were producing, and we've seen some here, and the fact that they are increasingly visible, that these messages, given the fact that they are that young people on one hand are having more access to this type of production, that they are seeing it working, is also triggering a sort of a ripple effect of claiming ownership of your own voice. For some, again, I've been working on this since '06, and increasingly I'm shocked at the way some of the tools, the sort of a toolbox of youth-generated media is expanding in such a way that now I have an assistant, and I'm actually asking for another assistant to actually just be able to keep up with just collecting data. Forget about analyzing. Forget about going out and meeting the folks who are actually producing this type of media. I can talk more, but I'd rather hear from you now. And sorry, I got stuck here, but
it's good to see friendly faces.
Okay, so thanks again, everyone, for coming. This is the question and answer portion. Please keep your comments or questions to a minute to a minute and a half. And we'll take 3 at a time, and then Joe can answer or respond. So anybody have any questions? Not all at once. No questions or comments? Yes?
I teach business, and one of the things that we're concerned with or looking at is the degree to which the young people are using this media or these media to interact with and talk back to brands and social structures that they're involved in. So, I mean, it's happening not just in the political realm, but also in the business realm. And I'm just wondering if it's something that's a sort of a cultural thing among youth, that they're now, as you mentioned earlier, finding their voice and wanting to interact with their environment in a verbal and visual way.
taking 3 or?
There was one over there.
I initially had one question, but I'm going to add it.
Because they're recording.
Have press?
Yeah.
I initially had one question, but I'm going to add up to the question the gentleman asked. My first question was about, because as you mentioned, there's not a specific leader usually or a spokesperson for the youth movement when something is happening. So my question for you is, if there is going to be a need for it, how do you think it would be the form of it being like a social election, let's say, or a social nomination for it? Or would it be just somebody coming and the others would either be accepting him or not based on their commands? The second thing, so based on the corporate branding and branding going into the social media, to what extent also those social media will remain authentic? Companies and corporate companies will start to try to reach to the youth, and would that, by doing so, would it undermine the whole platform that the youth are going away from a usual mass media? If corporations and brands start doing it, would they start a whole new platform? Well,
Okay, the idea of marketing, I mean, this has been happening perhaps ever since Nike came up with the Just Do It. The idea of trying to appeal for the individual, especially with the young. And then Apple picked up on it with the whole idea of customization of elements. And then Amazon and so on. I guess what I'm trying to say is the idea that, let me take it back a bit. What I mean by youth-generated media is something that's broader than social media itself. Social media is just one component of it, and social media is a tool that young people are using, pretty much the way they use the chalks to actually write on stuff, any type of banners to write their messages on. And the fact that corporations have tapped into that sense of individuality, it goes both ways. They appeal to it because they can now customize the shoe. They're able to customize the shoe based on what you would want. So the idea of the mass production is gone because of their ability to do this. I'm very much wary of the idea of co-optation. Because the idea of co-optation happens on several levels. It happens on the level of the businesses tapping into this and seeing it as oh, okay, now young people are wanting to claim their voice. Here's a tool that you can buy to claim your voice. The idea of co-optation is happening also on other levels. My work in Saudi Arabia sort of suggests that, they're picking up because of the process of Saudization, the idea that they want to localize the jobs. They're actually tapping into anyone with the slightest bit of talent and asking them to enter an advertising agency and take a job. When they would rather be happy doing graffiti work. So the idea of co-optation happens on various levels. Somebody here, I quoted mainstream media sort of saying, hey, why don't you form a political party? Who knows what's happening behind the scenes, if you're referring to Egypt or Tunisia in this case. Who knows what's happening right now behind the scenes, tapping into or befitting a certain people and actually calling them leaders. The process of election and so on is something that, again, fits within a particular formal structure that you are trying to impose on them when perhaps they have never thought of this. And I've worked on or with the folks doing interviews, oral history interviews with the folks of the Independence of Hive, both people who are members of political parties and people who were part of the civil society. And the stories that they tell you suggest that on several occasions, at least for the first month, until March 14th, they were not only spearheading, they were way ahead of the political leaders in terms of planning, suggesting, and organizing themselves and developing creative acts of resistance. And they were constantly being sort of held back by the political organizations to which they reported. So I don't know if this helps clarify this idea.
Joe, how do you explain the fact that during the uprising and the overthrow of the Egyptian regime, it was precisely when the regime cut off Facebook and Twitter and cell phones that you had the biggest crowds going out into Tahrir Square? In other words, there's an inverse linkage between the availability of social media and the political mobilization of masses of courageous people.
Precisely why I look at it, I look at social media as being one of several tools that young people use in order to get their message across. At one point it was that, at another point it was the mobile phones, and then once you're on the street, it's the word of mouth, it's the writing on on banners and holding them. It's the songs, it's the jokes, it's all sort of types of performative acts that we somehow don't see them, and we don't consider them as being sort of communication tools, but they are, even if they are that dent in the wall. Even mainstream media in this case becomes a platform that they use in order to get their message across. When you hold a banner written in English, you're not holding it for your fellow citizens. You're holding it for BBC. You're holding it for CNN. You're not holding it for those folks. And again, this is not something that's new. The Chinese did that in Tiananmen Square 20 years ago. This is why the idea of looking at it in a sort of a historical sense, the idea of co-optation, to go back to your, now that I sort of comes to mind, the idea of co-optation. In the US they faced it. The students for Democratic SDS, they were easily co-opted by CBS and the New York Times, because they said, okay, you become the leader, we were going to interview you because you have a charismatic image and you're well spoken. But the people who were actually working and doing most of the grunt work were not framed by the media. Because the New York Times didn't see them as appealing to their own agenda.
Dr.
I'm glad you stayed away from the cliche that's been so popularly used today by calling social, the social media. But wouldn't you consider now even the term you use now, youth-generated media, after what happened in Egypt and other Arab countries, it is now no longer useful. Wouldn't you consider calling it, for instance, protester-generated media? Especially that we see now a convergence, the wedding of what they call social media, with the television, with the folk media, and this is not only limited to the youth. It is now we're talking about protest, and the protest is not only for young people. Of course, young people ignited it, and I think that's. But it was the wedding, the convergence of all these media that resulted. So we didn't consider calling it protest-generated media, but youth in itself, as you started at the beginning, when you said youth could be someone in the 50s.
Yeah. Sorry.
My question is about the professional media such as Arabiya, Jazeera, BBC. It's all. No?
A little closer to you. A little closer.
Okay. Which are turning to the citizens and creating YouTube channels for the citizens who are filming any kind of event to upload it through their channel. So in a way, the citizen is kind of a journalist and is a source of news. We saw the example of Iran also, where the mass media or the foreign media was not allowed to film the protests. And do you see a danger somehow in this, where there's no credible source, there's no more, everything is instant, everything is, where is this leading in the end?
And just a small note I should have asked earlier, but
I'm sorry. It's Rania Massoud from L'Orient Le Jour.
Rania, you're reminding us that we live in a postmodern world where everything is in flux. And there are no credible sources anymore. But I'm going to try and sort of address both concerns. There's a term that's gaining that has gained currency for quite a bit of time now. It's called radical media. John Downing was the one who came up with that, which addresses precisely how social movements use specific forms of media to attract attention. Greenpeace and the anti-nuclear movement are some of the examples that he gives about that. My work on youth-generated media takes what happens in these uprisings as one of several instances of youth-generated media. The fact that young people were involved in the making of these messages, and that these messages are sort of self-expressive of their own cultural politics. But also in the clip, you've seen. Unfortunately, she passed away, but she was a very vocal female blogger from Saudi Arabia who was the first to use her real name in the blogs. And her name is Hadil Hadayf. And some of the things that she worked on was taking her message beyond just the actual online aspect to go into schools and encourage young Saudi females to take on blogging as a way of owning a voice. Now, that's why I'm thinking of, or I'm trying to position youth-generated media as being an entry point to understanding young people's politics. Why would young people go out and film the drivers who do the drifting, the clip that you've seen? Okay, so one could, I wasn't at all interested in the actual drivers themselves. Okay, I leave that to sociologists and psychologists to actually ask them why they're involved in something like that. But why would you want to do this? And my first impression was walking into this world was, okay, maybe they are fans and that's it. But they're not. They have a completely different approach to this. They position themselves as, as equal partner in this process as the drivers. So they're not just followers in that sense. And, it's a whole, I'll leave that for the book, but it's a whole message right there.
I'm the country director for International Alert and also a PhD student at the University of Toronto. My dissertation is on youth in political parties in Lebanon, so thank you for a fascinating presentation first off. I want to ask a question. Granted, it's a little bit, I think, outside of what you've presented, but I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on it. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see as the surrounding conditions, if they're political conditions, social conditions, or perhaps linkages that youth are able to make with other types of organized groups that allow youth-generated media to then progress and flourish to have identifiable political impact. For example, like in Egypt, for this example, although it is early to tell what's going to happen, as opposed to perhaps the other example that you referred to, 2005 in Lebanon, where many have argued a lot of that youth energy became swept up into the same sectarian logic that predominates. So why in some places at some times and not other places? In a way, I'm asking that question.
The quick and the short answer to this, having interviewed both people within the so-called civil society who were part of the Independence 05, and and people who were representative of the political parties who were involved in this, there came a point towards March 14th where the people who are involved in this as representative of their political parties were pulled away from their involvement. And people who were part of the civil society were also restrained by the fact that, okay, those guys are pulling away. And they were not getting the same visibility, which brings me to the following. In Egypt, at least to my knowledge, given having spent some time there in 2008, during the time when they were trying to organize demonstrations then, it's not a politically motivated, or it doesn't have a political cast on it. Political in the sense of a political party with a specific ideology, whereas in Lebanon it did have that, and that makes a huge difference in this. As far as the media that was generated out of this, I mean, there are fascinating stories about the brainstorming that went on in terms of creating these events, these performative acts, to keep a certain momentum and a certain interest, and to keep a message going. The tricks that they did in terms of attracting media attention and using media attention, the staging aspect of it, is fascinating, which has nothing to do with whether they are, at least in my opinion, it has nothing to do with whether they are members of a political party or not. The only added value that they had, being members of a political party, was the fact that you could mobilize a certain number of people and make sure that they are there if you want to have a human flag, or if you want to have a human chain. Case in point, the human chain that they did, they had figures coming from the political parties that they could actually do it once and come back, and that's it. As far as a human chain, go from the Martyr Square to the assassination site, and they managed to do it, like, I think 3 times, if I recall it well, because people showed up, volunteered. So that's the only type of difference that you have, I think, in terms of actually mobilizing people.
Maybe 3 comments, first from you, and then Dr. Zajani.
I want to respond, just simply respond to the, I mean, I'm in agreement with most of your answers, but I would like to take issue with your branding protest with radicalism. And this is a Western error. And I think that's one of the reasons why the West cannot really understand what's going on in the Arab world. When they brand protest with radicalism. Boaz in Tunisia was a protester, not a radical. And most of what's going on in the Arab world are protests and not radicalism. When you start treating protesters as radicals, that's the problem. That's why the West has failed to really deal with the Arab world.
My name is Munir Nabdi. I'm part of the Hibr team here, there are a couple of us. We run a youth-powered alternative monthly newspaper here in Lebanon that gets distributed around the country. And the question I have, that as we've seen in the last couple weeks, couple months, how youth-generated content and youth activists have maybe in some ways been co-opted, but if not co-opted, they have been filtered by media. And sometimes we see some comments on Twitter, etc., about how looking at CNN or Al Jazeera, sometimes it feels like you're at a tweet up, since much of their content is coming from tweets and coming from other social media, other young people on the ground. But what I'm really curious about, and what we're trying to do and experiment, is how we can remove that filter and develop an outlet here, but then also we're working to support other outlets to have young people be creating the content directly and having it go online directly and go out into, maybe in some ways, traditional media methods, that we are in print, we're not only in social media spheres, but I was curious in terms of your wanderings, your research, etc., both in the region and maybe even beyond, if you've seen examples of this, or successes of this, or ways that even traditional media has tried to remove the filter to allow young people to have that voice unencumbered by the adult element of filtering and kind of, I don't know, reducing the ability of young people to go directly online.
Hi, my name is Rabi Al-Khudur. I'm a branding professional and an aspiring academic as well. 2 questions within the framework of social movements and political change, since this is the hot topic. First, I'm really interested in knowing more about your experience in Saudi. I mean, obviously, in today's day and age, for youth-generated media to have some sort of effect, whether internally or externally, you need some sort of openness. And Saudi being a closed, at some points, repressive society, how really effective are youth-generated media in reaching out to and actually reaching their goals? Because let's face it, this type of media is generated because youngsters want to change at some point, or just as a release. But anyway, it's a release about something that they don't like around themselves. The other point is back again to the idea of mainstream versus alternative media. I mean, obviously, with alternative media, there's more freedom, there's more of a carte blanche, whereas in mainstream media, there's more commercial and political interest. So what's your take on, with respect of a potential power shift where the mainstream media would cut its guard a bit down with respect to this influx of alternative media? As you said, I mean, you need two assistants. There was a study now that if you want to read all the tweets in your stream, you need a lifetime for one day. I mean, it's quite an impressive amount of data. So I'd be interested to know your take on both of those issues. Thank you.
I'll combine your last comment with Munir's question. I think the relationship between mainstream media and alternative media is a sort of a love-hate relationship. Both want to use and be used by one another. The mainstream media wants alternative media because it supplies it with access that it doesn't have. But at the same time, it wants to retain this idea of control and filtering that its political economy forces it to have. So the idea of having a collaboration of some sorts between alternative and mainstream media is sort of a doomed to some type of a failure. The only sort of experience that is very helpful, and I've been following your work. We can talk later on. And I think one of the things that you may want to look into, and I think you did, are the independent media centers. And we have one in Lebanon. It hasn't been, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, I don't think it has been very active. But I think that type of approach is sort of combines both, has a certain level of opening up to a maximum, allowing collaborations, but at the same time with a goal. And it emulates the best that traditional or mainstream media can offer. Concerning my experience in Saudi, I think it's a very I think the view from outside about it being very limiting is very misleading. And I did spend I spent all in all about 6-8 months there for research, on and off, because you do a longitudinal type of work, in many cases, their interest is completely different from the interest that you would try to put in on them. Ibrahim Abbas did you may want to check them out, Abaliso, basically dealing with Ramadan and wanting to sort of use verses from the Quran, getting inspired by that to develop a plot that gets acted out, and reminding people of certain virtues that they need to focus on during the month. You take that motivation and try to place it somewhere else, it's different. I was interested in sort of, not in terms of comparing Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, but also looking at two different experiences. The first was the idea that in Lebanon, anyone who wants to work in a media organization can actually do so. Given the right wasta, you can actually do media if you want to do that. In Saudi Arabia, you can't, even if you have the wasta. Because the actual institutions, media institutions, putting press aside, are not there, or are not there enough to actually do that, and are not open to various ideas. So what makes young people in that particular society want to do alternative media is completely different from why they want to do it in here. I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you. My name is Niam. I'm part-time faculty at LAU in the Communication Arts Department, and I'm ex-producer at Al Jazeera Arabic. So going back to...
And the former student.
And the former student of Joe. Going back to the title, Uprisings and the Youth-Generated Media, I'm interested in the percentage you would give to mainstream media, actually. The give and take from youth-generated media. But I think without the coverage of mainstream media, I personally think the uprisings wouldn't have been as powerful. I don't want to say they would have failed, but I think mainstream media played a huge role in pulling youth-generated media and pushing it to the front worldwide.
Short end of it, they managed to, and again, if you look at the second point, what we need to look at is why they use specific media coming from particular countries and they ignore others. And that is, that is something that is worth interest. Whereas when it comes to youth-generated media, young people are doing because they want to express themselves. Now, whether it gets picked up by mainstream media is a different story that we need to address. I'm not doing that right now, but I'm saying, it's up for all of us to sort of ask the question why we're doing this. I spoke about a coverage of an all Egypt all the time coverage. Why? Why do we have an all Egypt all the time coverage? There were other things happening in the world. It begs the question. So yes, I agree with you. Mainstream media help to do that. Why? Is the other question.
Any other questions? No? If that's it then, thank you for coming. If you have any final comments, Joe?
Thank you.
No? Okay. All right. Thanks again.